In Canada, there are nearly 24 registered political parties, and they all fall somewhere along what we call the political spectrum. But is it time to move away from this model to something a bit more accurate when representing Canadians' beliefs?
So the conventional notion of ideology was a left-right spectrum, beginning with kind of communism on the far left, then socialism and capitalism sort of in the middle, and then fascism on the right.
That's Neil Tomlinson. He's an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University. Neil says, conventionally, the left meant someone who believed in an activist government, while the right meant supremacy of the individual.
So that was really the conventional division between the left and the right. Nowadays, though, it's all become very muddy because what has overlain this whole question, especially in countries like Canada, are questions of identity and sort of how government should work.
So this is basically where the major Canadian parties fall on the spectrum. The Conservative Party falls to the right, the Liberals land near the center, while the NDP are the left. And while it may seem that each party has changed over the years, Neil says the reality is the parties themselves really haven't moved on the spectrum since their creation.
Well, economically, I think they fall pretty much where they've always fallen. The NDP is a social democratic party, so it's, not quite socialist, but almost. The Liberals probably are where they've always been, which is sort of in the center, and depending on which forces are in power within the Liberal Party at any one given time, they might lurch a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, but they're basically free marketers. And conservatives, small c conservatives, the ideology, don't even really exist anymore because coupled with their view of the organic whole in traditional conservatism was the notion that the wealthy have an obligation to look after the less wealthy, which they called noblesse oblige.
This is Brittany Andrea-Mofa. She's a senior policy and research analyst at the Broadbent Institute. Brittany agrees with Neil that the parties haven't moved much on the spectrum to a certain extent.
So I would say the Conservative Party is on the right of the political spectrum. The Liberal Party is still center of the spectrum, and the NDP would be on the left of the spectrum. I would say overall, the parties have moved somewhat to the left. There is some interesting rumblings within the conservative or right end of the spectrum. We're seeing some fractions break off, partly because they don't feel as if the Conservatives are maybe sticking to traditional conservative or right-wing values as they once had.
The reason why Brittany believes the parties have moved slightly left on the Canadian political spectrum is because of the social rights and values our society has been given.
The passing of gay marriage, we also see that with women's rights and the right to abortion being a right that has been fought for over time that wasn't always there for women. The Multiculturalism Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So those are guaranteed rights that everybody or every Canadian is afforded by virtue of citizenship. And those are more left-wing progressive values where people were in the creation of a more fair and just society.
So let's say the three main parties are moving slightly on the political spectrum. Would that be a bad thing?
I do not think it's entirely a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing if the electorate is unaware or if it's done through manipulative or deceitful tactics or means. I think if a political party wants to move on the political spectrum, I think flexibility is good within politics. When political parties become too fixed, then they become resistant to change and resistant to maybe the moments of the time and maybe even resistant to new ways of thinking. So having some flexibility in which a party can kind of figure out how they want to approach issues, I think that's good.
And while the parties haven't moved much on the political spectrum, Neil says there's a newer and possibly more accurate way to see where Canadians may land politically.
There's a political compass online where people can answer a whole pile of questions, and it sort of shows where they end up in a 4-part quadrant.
The political compass looks at a person's ideology as a quadrant. You have your left and right spectrum, but then at the top of the vertical axis, you have authoritarian, and at the bottom, libertarian. Authoritarianism means giving up your freedom and obeying authority, while libertarianism is defined as individual rights, political freedom, and autonomy.
What it does is it forces you to kind of recognize that there may be competing forces at work here. right? Where you can feel in ideological left-right terms, you can feel quite left-wing, but then maybe you're quite authoritarian around your position in terms of what the state should be doing and not doing, right? Like there are lots of left-wing people who are anti-immigration, for example, right? Well, left-wing economically, but they're opposed to immigration. There are lots of right-wing people who are right-wing economically, but are quite supportive of equal rights and charter provisions and all that kind of stuff.
If Canadian voters knew where they landed politically in a quadrant compared to the typical left-right spectrum, would that have made this past federal election easier to digest?
I think this election was hard for a number of Canadians because there were a number of social issues that were on the forefront, moral issues as well. And I think that can be difficult to deal with during an election. Elections can be a hard time for us to have for those in politics and those running to have full comprehensive conversations around what's happening.
This includes, but is definitely not limited to, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's blackface brownface scandal, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh facing racism, the People's Party political platform, Bill 21, and much more. But when it's all said and done, how can Canadian voters take what the parties are promising them and decide who to vote for?
What would really be good, in my opinion, is if every single Canadian voter would actually take the time and trouble to read the platforms of every party and decide on the basis of what's in those platforms how they're going to vote, recognizing that they're never going to find a party that is exactly going to represent what they want. So maybe, like it's not just a matter of totting up the number of issues that you agree with, but how strongly you feel about those issues, and then voting. And then we would have a result that would resemble somehow the viewpoint of Canadians, whereas I'm not really very convinced that we have that now.